The exposure triangle. What is it? Welcome to another Learn Photography for Free video. The question has been asked. I've often seen or heard people referring to the exposure triangle. What is the exposure triangle? Hi, and welcome to this lesson on the exposure triangle. Exposure in photography refers to the amount of light that is allowed to reach the camera's image sensor when a photograph is being taken. The correct exposure is essential for producing high-quality images, as too much light or too little light can result in an image being too bright or too dark. In photography, the exposure triangle refers to the three main factors that control the exposure of a photograph. Those factors being aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three factors work together to determine the amount of light that enters the camera and is recorded in the photograph. Let's start with aperture. Aperture is one of the most confusing settings on a camera because it has two distinct functions. The first function is the depth of field, which is the range of distances around your subject of the photograph that is in acceptable sharpness or focus. Depth of field is controlled by f-stops, with a small f-stop number corresponding to a small depth of field, a large f-stop number corresponding to a large depth of field. A small depth of field is often used in portraiture to isolate your subject from the background. It blurs the background. While a large depth of field is commonly used in landscape photography to keep the entire image in focus. The second function of aperture is to control the amount of light that passes through the lens and reaches the camera sensor. Again, aperture is measured in f-stops, and a large aperture is represented by a small f-stop number. For example, f1.8 or 2.8 are large apertures because it lets a lot of light into the lens. Conversely, f16 or f22 is a small aperture because the iris opening in the lens is small and only allows a small amount of light to pass through. In photography, making the aperture smaller is known as stopping down, while making the aperture larger is called opening up. It's important to understand how aperture works and how it affects the exposure and depth of field in a photograph in order to take high quality images. Next we have shutter speed. The camera's shutter is a curtain in front of the image sensor that stays closed until the camera is triggered to take a photograph. When the camera is triggered, the shutter opens and exposes the image sensor behind it to light that has passed through the lens. After the sensor has collected the light, the shutter then closes, stopping the light from reaching the sensor. The button that triggers the camera to take a photograph is also called the shutter button, or just the shutter. Shutter speed is a setting in photography that refers to the speed at which the camera's shutter opens and closes during the exposure process. It plays a role in two functions. It stops motion by using a high shutter speed, so it opens and closes very quick, or creating blur by using slow shutter speed, so it opens and then closes. Shutter speed also controls the exposure of the photograph by allowing more or less light to reach the image sensor. A high shutter speed allows less light to enter the camera, resulting in a darker image, while a slow shutter speed allows more light to enter the camera, resulting in a brighter image. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, and most modern cameras, such as this one, can handle shutter speeds ranging from 1/8,000th of a second at the fastest to 30 seconds at its slowest. By understanding how shutter speed works and how it affects the motion blur and exposure in a photograph, photographers can take more effective and high quality images. Then finally we have ISO. ISO is a measure of the camera's sensitivity to light. At higher ISO values, the image may start to show more noise, which is an undesirable grainy texture that can degrade the overall quality of the photograph. It's best to use the lowest ISO value when possible in order to get the highest quality image. This is because lower ISO values on your camera result in less noise and a higher dynamic range, which is the range of tones that the camera can capture. However, in certain circumstances, such as low light and low light conditions, it may be necessary to use a higher ISO in order to properly expose the photograph. In these cases, it is important to find the right balance between the desired exposure and the acceptable level of noise in your image. By understanding how ISO works and how it affects the exposure and the quality of a photograph, photographers can more effectively control the look and feel of their images, their photos. This makes up the exposure triangle. In order to properly expose a photograph, the photographer must balance these three factors: aperture, shutter, and ISO. The photographer must decide which combination of these factors will result in the desired exposure for the photograph, depending on the light and environment available. It's worth noting that each of these factors also has its own set of trade-offs. For example, using a large aperture, that's a small f-stop number, will result in a shallow depth of field, but it will also require a faster shutter speed to properly expose the photo. Similarly, using a higher ISO will increase the camera's sensitivity to light, but it will also result in increased image noise. By understanding the exposure triangle and how these three factors work together, photographers can more effectively control the look and the feel of their photos, their images. Thanks for watching, and I hope you now have a better understanding of the exposure triangle. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down in the comment section, and I will try my best to answer them in future videos. You may also send me an email to rian@rianru.co.za. Do subscribe and click that notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.